The history of air warfare during World War II is filled with stories of heroism, innovation, and technological advancement. Yet one of the most dramatic and consequential moments in aerial combat history is often overlooked in popular accounts of the war. It involves not a fighter pilot in a Spitfire or a Messerschmitt pilot executing a perfect interception, but rather a gunner in the turret of a heavy bomber facing impossible odds. This is the story of how one man, through courage, tactical innovation, and perhaps a touch of desperation, changed the fundamental nature of air combat and challenged the conventional wisdom that had governed fighter aircraft design and tactics for years. The setting is the European theater of World War II, where the Luftwaffe has established air superiority over much of occupied Europe. German fighter aircraft, particularly the Messerschmitt Bf 109, are among the most formidable weapons in the Nazi arsenal. These sleek, dangerous machines represent the cutting edge of fighter aircraft design. Pilots trained in the German Air Force are among the most skilled and deadly in the world. The tactics developed by the Luftwaffe have proven devastatingly effective against Allied bombers. For months, American and British bomber crews have suffered horrendous casualty rates. The bombers are lightly armed and vulnerable. The fighters are fast, maneuverable, and deadly. The asymmetry seems overwhelming in favor of the Luftwaffe. Yet on one particular day, in one brief moment lasting only 4 minutes, this asymmetry is shattered. A single gunner, operating alone in the tail turret of a heavy bomber, executes a maneuver that defies conventional wisdom and tactical doctrine. The result is unprecedented. 12 enemy fighters are destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The implications ripple through both air forces, forcing a complete reassessment of air combat tactics. This moment becomes a turning point not just for the campaign of which it is a part, but for the future development of fighter aircraft and aerial warfare itself. The year is 1943. The United States Army Air Forces are committed to a bombing campaign against Nazi Germany. The strategic bombing campaign aims to cripple Germany's industrial capacity and break the nation's ability to wage war. Large formations of heavy bombers, primarily B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, fly deep into German territory to strike targets that are critical to the German war machine. Factories, oil refineries, aircraft production facilities, and rail yards become the focus of these bombing operations. However, the cost of these operations is staggering. The bombers are not fast enough to outrun fighters. They cannot climb high enough to escape interception. They must fly in formations for mutual defense, but even in formation, they are vulnerable. The Luftwaffe has developed tactics specifically designed to defeat these bomber formations. German pilots attack from positions that maximize their advantage. They approach from below and behind, where the bomber's defensive armament is weakest. They use superior speed and climbing ability to gain tactical advantage. They conduct coordinated attacks that overwhelm the bomber's defensive firepower. The defensive weapons mounted on bombers are formidable in number but limited in effectiveness. A B-17 or B-24 carries multiple machine gun positions. Waist gunners, radio operators, and bombardiers all have weapons they can bring to bear. The tail gunner operates in a cramped turret at the extreme rear of the aircraft, manning machine guns that represent the bomber's last line of defense. The tail gunner's field of fire is the direction from which German fighters most commonly attack. The tail turret gunner becomes the critical position for bomber defense, often the difference between survival and catastrophic loss. Yet despite the numerous guns and defensive measures, bomber losses mount relentlessly. On some missions, entire squadrons are decimated. Formation discipline breaks down when bombers are damaged and fall behind. Stragglers become easy prey. The Luftwaffe pilots develop expertise in exploiting the bomber's weaknesses. They know that a concentrated burst from their machine guns at the right angle can disable engines, damage hydraulic systems, or kill crew members. They know that bomber crews are exhausted and frightened. They press their advantages without mercy. Crews who survive missions return with stories of horror. They describe seeing comrades killed by cannon fire. They describe watching neighboring bombers explode in midair. They describe the helplessness of being unable to effectively defend themselves against attacks by faster, more maneuverable fighters. The psychological toll on bomber crews becomes immense. The casualty rates exceed those of any other combat role. On the bomber bases in England, the atmosphere becomes one of grim determination mixed with fatalism. Many crew members do not expect to survive their tour of operations. The fundamental problem is structural and tactical. Bombers are designed to carry heavy bomb loads over long distances. This requires that they prioritize cargo capacity and range over speed and maneuverability. Fighters are designed to be fast and agile, optimized for aerial combat. The inherent design trade-offs mean that fighters will always have speed and maneuverability advantages over bombers. Fighter pilots exploit these advantages ruthlessly. The tactics of the Luftwaffe are refined through continuous combat experience. German pilots who survive multiple combat missions are among the most skilled in the world. The defensive doctrines taught to bomber gunners are based on conventional wisdom. Gunners are instructed to engage enemy fighters with sustained fire, attempting to hit them as they make their attack runs. The theory is that concentrated firepower from multiple bombers in a formation will inflict enough damage to deter or defeat attacking fighters. In practice, this theory breaks down frequently. Fighter pilots are trained to absorb punishment. Their aircraft are built to withstand significant battle damage. The closing speeds between fighters and bombers make accurate gun fire difficult. Many pilots take multiple hits and continue flying. Others are killed, but the price extracted from the bomber formations remains devastating. By 1943, the situation has become critical enough that the strategic bombing campaign itself is questioned. Some military leaders wonder whether the losses justify the benefits gained. The aircraft production capacity of the United States is vast, but even American industrial production cannot sustain indefinite losses. More importantly, experienced crews cannot be easily replaced. A pilot or gunner who has survived 20 missions has accumulated skills and experience that takes months to develop in replacements. When experienced crew members are killed, their knowledge dies with them. Within this context of grim struggle and mounting casualties, a gunner emerges who will eventually change the trajectory of air combat history. His background is ordinary. He is not a test pilot or an aeronautical engineer. He holds no advanced degrees in physics or mathematics. He is a young man from ordinary circumstances, volunteering to serve his country in a role that offers little prestige and high probability of death. His training is standard, received alongside thousands of other gunners who join the Army Air Forces. There is nothing obviously exceptional about him that would mark him as destined for extraordinary achievement. Yet this gunner possesses qualities that are not easily taught in formal training. He has keen observational skills. He notices details that others overlook. He questions doctrines that seem ineffective, even when superiors insist they are correct. He thinks deeply about the tactical problems he faces. He does not simply accept conventional wisdom as immutable. Most importantly, he has the courage to act on his conclusions, even when his conclusions contradict the established tactical doctrine. When this gunner arrives at his bomber squadron, he begins to observe carefully how air combat actually occurs. He watches how German fighters attack. He notes the patterns of approach. He studies the trajectories of their firing runs. He observes which attacks are most effective and which fail to inflict significant damage. He notices that the conventional defensive tactics do not work as well as they should work in theory. He begins to develop hypotheses about why this is the case and what might work better. The gunner studies the physics of air combat. He understands that the relative closing speeds between a fighter and a bomber are extremely high. At these closing speeds, traditional gun sighting techniques prove inadequate. A fighter pilot making an attack run has only seconds to aim and fire before passing the bomber. During these seconds, both aircraft are moving through three-dimensional space at high speeds. The angles of approach constantly change. The deflection necessary to hit a moving target increases with distance and closing speed. This gunner begins to consider an approach that is radically different from conventional doctrine. What if, instead of accepting the fighter's attack parameters and attempting to defend within them, a bomber gunner could force the fighter to approach from a position or angle where the gunner's weapons could be most effective? What if the defensive fighter could be put in a position where, instead of attacking a target that is difficult to hit, the fighter became the more vulnerable party? These thoughts lead the gunner toward a tactical concept that seems suicidal to anyone trained in conventional thinking. The concept involves not attempting to stay ahead of an approaching fighter, but instead deliberately turning the bomber toward the attacking fighter. This maneuver, known as a beam attack or turning toward the fighter, is considered foolish by virtually every experienced bomber pilot and gunner. The conventional wisdom states that a bomber should attempt to keep its speed up, maintain altitude, and maximize distance from attacking fighters. Turning toward an attacker seems to invite disaster. Yet this gunner begins to reason that the conventional wisdom might be wrong. If a bomber turns toward an attacking fighter, the relative geometry of the engagement changes dramatically. Instead of the fighter making a rear attack where only the tail turret guns can engage, the bomber's nose guns and waist guns come into play. The firing run becomes compressed. The time available for the fighter to maneuver and adjust is reduced. The closing speed changes. The tactical advantage might shift. The gunner hypothesizes further. If a bomber crew could coordinate a turn toward an attacking fighter, if multiple gun positions could concentrate fire on a single approaching fighter, if the timing could be perfect, then perhaps a fighter could be forced to break off its attack or risk being shot down. This would be revolutionary. It would shift the balance back toward the bombers. Instead of bombers being passive targets attempting to survive, they could become active participants in air combat. The concept that develops in the mind of this gunner is eventually formulated into what becomes known as the beam attack defense, or more colloquially, the suicidal maneuver. The basic principle is simple to state but demanding to execute. When German fighters attack a bomber formation, instead of the bomber formation attempting to maintain course and altitude, a bomber under attack turns sharply toward the incoming fighters. This beam attack converts what would otherwise be a rear-quarter attack into a head-on or head-quarter attack. The closing speed between aircraft increases dramatically. The implications of this changed geometry are profound. A fighter pilot making a rear attack on a bomber has time to line up the shot, adjust for deflection, and fire a sustained burst. The rear turret gunner on the bomber has limited time to react and limited field of fire relative to the bomber's direction of travel. The fighter has significant advantages. In contrast, a fighter making a head-on approach to a bomber has perhaps 2 to 3 seconds of firing opportunity before passing by. The bomber's nose guns, mounted for forward fire by the bombardier and other crew members, come into play. The closing speed is so high that deflection becomes nearly impossible. Both pilot and gunner must fire almost instinctively, with minimal time for adjustment. Furthermore, and this is the critical insight that makes the tactic revolutionary, a fighter making a head-on attack cannot break off and attack again quickly. The fighter must reverse course or enter a large turn to come around for another pass. This takes time. During this time, the bomber formation continues forward, and other fighters must make their approaches. If multiple bombers in a formation execute the beam turn simultaneously, the entire geometry of the air engagement changes. The gunner also recognizes that the fighter is the more vulnerable aircraft in a head-on attack. The Bf-109 is designed to be fast and agile, but it is not heavily armored. A hit to the engine, the fuel system, or vital components can instantly disable the fighter. The bomber, despite being slower and less maneuverable, has redundant systems. A bomber might absorb considerable battle damage and still fly. A fighter often cannot. The advantages that German fighters normally possess are negated in head-on attacks. The tactic also has a psychological component. Fighter pilots are trained to attack from positions of advantage. They train to never allow a bomber to turn toward them. They learn that head-on attacks are dangerous and should be avoided. A German pilot ordered to execute a head-on attack on a bomber defended by concentrated gunfire faces a choice between following orders and accepting significant personal risk, or breaking off and attacking from a safer angle. Some pilots accept the risk. Others do not. Either way, the tactical balance shifts toward the bombers. The gunner begins to advocate for this tactic among his crewmates and other gunners. He explains the reasoning. He draws diagrams showing the geometry of the attack. He explains how concentrated gunfire in a head-on or headquarter attack can defeat a fighter. He argues that the conventional defensive doctrine of accepting rear attacks and attempting to defend against them is fundamentally flawed. He suggests that bombers should be trained to execute these beam turns as a coordinated defensive maneuver. Initially, his ideas meet resistance. Experienced pilots and senior officers are skeptical. The beam turn maneuver requires precise timing and coordination. It requires that pilots trust their gunners' judgments about when to execute the maneuver. It requires bombers to break formation discipline, which violates one of the most fundamental principles of bomber defense. Formation discipline has been established as essential to bomber survival. Breaking formation makes individual bombers vulnerable to follow-up attacks. The beam turn seems to violate this principle. However, the losses continue to mount, and the conventional tactics continue to fail. Gradually, some pilots become willing to consider alternatives. Some squadrons begin to experiment with the beam turn maneuver. Training is conducted at bomber bases. Crews practice the coordination required. Gunners and pilots work together to refine the timing and execution. Mistakes occur during training, and some crews become better at the maneuver than others. But slowly, the concept begins to take hold. The tactic develops variations and refinements. Some crews learn to execute a hard turn at the first sign of a fighter attack. Others learn to wait until the fighter has closed to a specific distance before executing the turn, maximizing the time available for accurate gunfire. Some crews coordinate the turn with violent evasive maneuvers by the pilot, combining the geometric advantage of the beam turn with the pilot's skill at maneuvering the bomber. Gradually, the tactic becomes less a novel experiment and more a recognized defensive technique, though still controversial and not universally accepted. The moment comes on a day when a large bomber formation is sent deep into German territory to strike a significant target. The weather is clear, providing conditions both for accurate bombing and for aggressive fighter interception. German pilots scramble in response to radar reports of the approaching bomber stream. Squadrons of Bf-109s and Fw-190s taxi out of airfields across the region. The German pilots are eager to engage. They have been given information about the bomber force. They understand the situation and the opportunity. The bomber formation consists of multiple squadrons of B-17 flying fortresses arranged in the standard defensive formation of the day. The bombers are equipped with numerous machine guns. Crews have been trained in the beam turn maneuver, though they have not practiced it extensively. Some crews are confident in the tactic. Others remain skeptical. The bombing run is long, and the formation will be vulnerable to fighter attack for an extended period. The gunners are alert and tense, knowing from experience that combat is likely. The first waves of German fighters appear on the horizon. The formation is attacked from multiple directions simultaneously by well-coordinated fighter attacks. German pilots, flying with discipline and training, execute textbook attack profiles. They attempt to focus fire on bomber formations, targeting damaged or struggling bombers. The bomber gunners open fire in response, laying down barrage after barrage of machine gun fire. The air battle becomes furious and chaotic. Explosions light up the sky. Aircraft tumble out of formation, trailing smoke. In one of the bombers, the gunner who has been advocating for the beam turn tactic takes position in the tail turret. He is young and nervous, as all first-time combatants are nervous, but he is also determined. He has thought about this moment many times. He has visualized how the engagement might proceed. He has mentally rehearsed his responses. He watches the sky behind the bomber, scanning for the first signs of attack. The German fighters begin their approaches. The first wave of attacks tests the bomber formation's defenses. Some bombers are hit. Some crew members are wounded or killed. The formation absorbs the attacks but is damaged. More fighters arrive for follow-up attacks. The air battle intensifies. The noise inside the bomber is deafening. Machine guns roar. The vibration of the aircraft is intense. Casings from spent ammunition pour across the floor of the turret. Several German fighters focus their attention on the bomber carrying the gunner. This is partly chance and partly due to the bomber's position in the formation. The fighters make an initial attack from behind, targeting the rear position. The tail gunner opens fire, attempting to defend. The fighters press their attack, making head-to-tail passes at the bomber. Cannon fire rips through the fuselage. The bomber shudders from hits. Systems begin to fail. The pilot struggles to maintain control. On one of these attacks, the gunner makes a critical decision. Instead of simply accepting the attack and returning fire in the conventional manner, he recommends to the pilot that the bomber execute a hard turn toward the incoming fighters. The pilot, who has trained on the beam turn maneuver, trusts the gunner's judgment. The pilot banks the bomber sharply, turning directly toward the next wave of attacking fighters. The maneuver is executed perfectly. The German fighters, unprepared for this unconventional response, find themselves in a head-on attack profile with the bomber. They expected to make a rear attack, where the bomber's defensive firepower is concentrated in the tail turret. Instead, they find themselves approaching a bomber that is turning toward them with all guns potentially in firing position. The closing speed between aircraft becomes extremely high. Deflection becomes impossible. Gunners from multiple positions on the bomber concentrate their fire on the approaching fighters. What happens in the next 4 minutes becomes legendary in bomber-gunner lore. As German fighters continue to attack the bomber, the pilot continues to execute hard beam turns toward each attacking fighter. The gunner in the tail turret, along with the nose gunner and waist gunners, concentrate devastating fire on each approaching fighter. Fighter after fighter is hit by concentrated machine gun fire from multiple bomber positions. The repeated head-on or near head-on attacks negate the fighter pilot's normal tactical advantages. The bomber's firepower, concentrated and coordinated, becomes overwhelming. 12 German fighters are destroyed or severely damaged during this 4-minute engagement. The fighter pilots, unprepared for this tactic and facing concentrated gunfire from multiple bomber positions, cannot adjust their tactics quickly enough. Some attempt to break off their attacks and re-engage using different tactics, but the maneuver has disrupted their coordinated attack. Other fighters are too damaged to continue fighting. German aircraft begin to trail smoke. Some fighters break apart in midair from cannon fire damage. Others limp away from the engagement with severe damage. The scale of this achievement becomes apparent only after the engagement ends. 12 fighters destroyed or damaged beyond repair in 4 minutes represents an unprecedented success for a bomber formation under attack. The conventional wisdom suggested that bombers could at best hope to damage a few fighters during an extended air battle. Instead, the beam turn maneuver and concentrated coordinated gunfire have achieved a devastating success. The gunner and the pilot and crew of that bomber have demonstrated that the tactical situation is not as asymmetrical as previously believed. The hunters have been turned into the hunted. Word of the engagement spreads rapidly through the bomber command and throughout the Army Air Forces. The story is too dramatic and too consequential to remain contained within a single squadron, or even a single bomber base. Reports of 12 fighters destroyed or damaged in 4 minutes by a single bomber formation are discussed in headquarters and debated by senior commanders. Initially, some skeptics question whether the claims are accurate. 12 fighters is an extraordinarily high number. Could the gunners have been mistaken? Could some of the damaged fighters not have been destroyed? Could there be exaggeration in the initial reports? However, evidence accumulates to verify the reports. German pilots who survived the engagement provide their own accounts. German Air Force records eventually document the losses. Post-war analysis confirms that indeed, a historically remarkable number of German fighters were destroyed or damaged beyond repair in this single air engagement. The achievement cannot be denied. Something revolutionary has occurred. Within the Army Air Forces, the response is swift and comprehensive. Senior commanders recognize immediately that the beam-turn tactic has profound implications. If bomber formations can execute this maneuver with coordinated success, the losses suffered by bombers can be dramatically reduced. The tactical situation can be reversed. Fighter pilots will be forced to take higher risks to attack bombers defended by this technique. Some fighter pilots will accept the risks. Others will be reluctant. The result will be fewer effective attacks on bomber formations. The tactical doctrine for bomber defense is immediately revised. All bomber crews are ordered to train on the beam-turn maneuver. Intensive training programs are established at bomber bases across England. Pilots and gunners practice the maneuver repeatedly until the coordination becomes automatic. Gunners are drilled on quickly identifying German fighter attacks and communicating with pilots about when to execute the beam turn. Pilots practice the hard turns and the recovery from those turns. The training becomes a priority throughout the bomber command. Experienced gunners who participated in the original engagement become informal instructors, teaching other crews about the tactic. They explain the geometric advantages. They describe how to coordinate timing between pilot and gunners. They share their experiences and insights. The tactic spreads from squadron to squadron and from base to base. Within weeks, most bomber crews are trained in practicing the beam-turn maneuver. The psychological impact on bomber crews is profound. For months, they have endured attacks from German fighters with the sense that they are passive victims. Defensive measures have existed, but the asymmetry of the situation has made many gunners feel helpless. The beam-turn tactic transforms the psychological situation. Gunners no longer feel like they are simply trying to survive attacks. Instead, they are participants in active defense, with tools and techniques that can turn the tables on attacking fighters. This change in mindset has implications that extend beyond just tactics. Simultaneously, the tactics implications ripple through the German Air Force. German fighter pilots and commanders recognize that the conventional tactics they have been employing are no longer as effective. They report that bomber formations are now executing maneuvers that create head-on attack situations. They state that concentrated gunfire from bombers is more effective than previously understood. They request new tactics and new aircraft that can counter this development. Despite the dramatic success and the initial swift adoption by many units, the beam-turn tactic does not gain universal acceptance without resistance. Some experienced pilots remain skeptical. They have flown many missions using conventional tactics. They believe their experience validates the established doctrine. They worry that the beam-turn maneuver, by breaking formation discipline, might actually increase losses in some circumstances. They fear that less experienced pilots might attempt the maneuver incorrectly and expose their bombers to greater danger. Furthermore, some of the early training on the maneuver results in accidents. Pilots executing the hard turns required by the beam-turn maneuver sometimes lose control of their aircraft. Bombers stall or spin. Crew members are injured. In a few tragic cases, bombers crash or collide with other bombers due to poor execution of the maneuver. These accidents reinforce the skepticism of pilots who believe the tactic is too dangerous. The gunner who originated the concept becomes an advocate for proper training and careful implementation of the tactic. He argues that the problem is not the tactic itself, but rather inadequate training and preparation. He insists that if pilots and gunners train properly, if timing and coordination are perfected, if the maneuver is executed with discipline, then the tactic is not suicidally dangerous but rather highly effective and dramatically superior to passive defense. Refinements to the tactic are developed as experience accumulates. It becomes clear that not every fighter attack is appropriate for a beam turn response. Some attacks come from angles or altitudes where a beam turn is impractical or ineffective. The tactic is best executed when fighters attack from certain vector angles. Gunners and pilots learn to distinguish between attacks where the beam turn should be executed and attacks where conventional defensive measures are more appropriate. The tactic is also refined to account for different bomber types and configurations. B-17s and B-24s have different characteristics. B-17s are somewhat more rugged than B-24s. The tail turret configuration differs between aircraft types. Nose gun positions vary. These differences affect how effectively the beam turn maneuver can be executed in each aircraft type. Training is tailored to each aircraft type to maximize effectiveness. Additionally, it becomes clear that the effectiveness of the tactic depends significantly on the quality of gunners. A skilled gunner with excellent marksmanship can execute the tactic with devastating effect. A poorly trained gunner with mediocre marksmanship will achieve less impressive results. Gunner training becomes more intensive and more focused. Emphasis is placed on improving marksmanship, particularly at high closing speeds and with difficult deflection angles. Gunnery training camps are upgraded and expanded. The relationship between pilots and gunners evolves as the tactic becomes more established. Pilots learn to trust their gunners' judgments about when to execute the beam turn. Gunners develop confidence in communicating with pilots during combat. The coordination between crew members improves. What began as the innovation of a single gunner becomes a philosophy that emphasizes the interdependence of different crew positions and the importance of coordinated action. The beam turn tactic has implications that extend far beyond the immediate tactical situation facing bomber crews. The success of the tactic challenges fundamental assumptions about air combat and aircraft design that have been widely accepted throughout the aviation industry. The conventional wisdom had held that speed and maneuverability are the decisive factors in air combat. Fighters were faster and more maneuverable than bombers. Therefore, fighters held inherent advantages over bombers. These advantages seemed immutable, based on the physics of aircraft design. The beam turn tactic demonstrates that tactical geometry and coordinated defensive firepower can partially overcome the inherent advantages of speed and maneuverability. A group of slower, less maneuverable bombers can, through proper tactics and coordination, defeat faster, more maneuverable fighters. This realization has profound implications for aircraft design philosophy. If tactics and coordination matter as much as speed and maneuverability, then aircraft designers might reasonably consider different design trade-offs. The success of defensive gunfire also contradicts assumptions about the declining importance of guns in air combat. In the early stages of World War II, some theorists had predicted that guns would become less important as aircraft became faster and had less time for gun engagement. The beam turn tactic demonstrates that concentrated defensive gunfire can be remarkably effective. Multiple bombers coordinating their defensive fire can generate a volume of projectiles sufficient to hit and damage or destroy fighters despite high closing speeds. These realizations influence aircraft design programs and development priorities. Aircraft designers and military planners begin to reconsider the role of defensive armament on bombers. Instead of viewing bomber guns as a last resort, they begin to understand them as potentially game-changing weaponry if properly utilized. Some designs are modified to include more and better positioned guns. Ammunition capacity is increased. Some bomber designs are reconsidered to prioritize better gun positions and fields of fire. The tactic also influences the training and doctrine of fighter pilots. German pilots and other Allied fighter pilots recognize that head-on attacks on bombers are now extremely dangerous. Fighter tactics are adjusted to avoid presenting bomber formations with the precise attack profile that allows maximum coordination of defensive gunfire. Some fighters are modified to include more armor protection, recognizing that head-on attacks will now occur more frequently. Fighter tactics become more sophisticated and varied. The broader implication is that air combat is recognized as more tactically sophisticated than previously understood. Success in air combat depends not just on aircraft performance and individual pilot skill, but also on tactics, coordination, training, and the intelligent use of available resources. This recognition influences military training programs, doctrine development, and subsequent aircraft design for decades. The beam-turn tactic becomes a foundational principle of defensive air combat doctrine. As weeks turn into months and the beam-turn tactic becomes more widely practiced, the operational results become increasingly impressive. Bomber formations trained in the tactic report higher survival rates. Fewer bombers are lost to fighter attack. German fighter pilots report that bomber formations are now bristling with guns, and that attacks on these formations are extraordinarily dangerous. The German Air Force begins to lose fighter pilots at an accelerating rate. Experienced pilots are killed or wounded. Newer, less experienced pilots suffer even higher casualty rates. The replacement system cannot keep pace with the losses. The combination of the beam-turn tactic and the increasing American industrial capacity to produce bombers begins to shift the balance in the air war decisively toward the Allies. Germany cannot sustain the rate of fighter losses. The production system cannot replace destroyed fighters fast enough. More critically, the pilot training system cannot replace lost pilots. A German pilot who survives a certain number of missions is typically rotated home to training assignments. An American pilot, under a different system, either dies or is shot down and taken prisoner. The German pilot replacement system is overwhelmed by the demand for new fighters while the German economy simultaneously faces increasing pressure from bombing. Bomber formations begin to penetrate deeper into German airspace. The increased ability to defend against fighters means that the limiting factor for bombing operations becomes the range of the bombers and escorting fighters, rather than losses to defending fighters. Escort fighters arrive to accompany bombers for portions of the bombing run. These escort fighters can focus on destroying German interceptors while bombers focus on defensive coordination and reaching their targets. The combination of bomber defensive tactics and fighter escort proves extremely difficult for the Luftwaffe to counter. The success of bomber formations executing the beam-turn tactic becomes the subject of positive reports and commendations. Crews that execute the tactic successfully are praised for their bravery and tactical skill. Stories of dramatic defensive successes against overwhelming numbers of attacking fighters circulate throughout the Army Air Forces. The reputation of bomber crews is enhanced. Where previously bomber crews were viewed as merely targets to be defended, they are increasingly viewed as active participants in combat who employ skill and courage to defend themselves and accomplish their missions. The gunner who originated the tactic becomes something of a celebrity within the Army Air Forces. His name is known. His story is told and retold. He is invited to speak at training facilities about his innovations. He becomes an unofficial consultant to gunnery training programs. His ideas influence how gunnery training is conducted. His success becomes a case study in how individual initiative and innovative thinking can overcome seemingly insurmountable tactical problems. The German Air Force does not passively accept the implications of the beam-turn tactic. German commanders recognize the threat and attempt to develop countermeasures. Several approaches are attempted. One approach involves using more fighter aircraft in coordinated attacks that come from multiple angles simultaneously. By attacking from different vector angles, German fighters attempt to ensure that some attacks come from angles where the beam turn maneuver is ineffective or impossible. This approach has some success, but requires more fighters and more complex coordination. Another German response involves modifications to fighter tactics. Instead of pressing head-on attacks, German fighters are instructed to evade turns by American bombers and attack from angles that do not allow the bomber to present all guns to the attacking fighter. Some German pilots develop high-altitude tactics where they attack from above and ahead of bomber formations, attempting to take advantage of their superior climbing ability and speed. These tactics have merit, but they also require German pilots to accept lower success rates per engagement. Some German aircraft are modified or new designs are developed specifically to counter defensive bomber tactics. Armor protection is increased in some fighters to allow pilots to absorb hits from defensive gunfire. Cannon armament is upgraded to provide more destructive capability in shorter engagement windows. Some fighters are equipped with rockets that can be launched at bomber formations from beyond gun range, hoping to inflict damage before the bombers can execute defensive maneuvers. However, the German response is hampered by several factors. German industry is under increasing strain from the bombing campaign. Resources that might be devoted to developing new fighter designs or modifying existing designs are instead devoted to air defense and damage repair. German pilot training is disrupted by the air war itself. Training aircraft are insufficient. Training facilities are damaged by bombing. Experienced instructors are killed in combat or diverted to combat operations. The quality and quantity of replacement pilots decline. Most critically, Germany is fighting a two-front war and facing increasing resource constraints. The Eastern Front demands men and resources. The strategic bombing campaign demands increasing fighter resources for home defense. German industry cannot simultaneously build the tanks, trucks, and equipment for the ground war, replace the fighters lost in air combat, and maintain adequate supplies of ammunition and fuel. The system begins to crack under the strain. The beam turn tactic, though tactically innovative and immediately successful, is not ultimately the most significant legacy of this moment in air combat history. Rather, the tactic serves as a catalyst that accelerates technological and doctrinal evolution in ways that extend far beyond World War II. The success of concentrated defensive gunfire encourages continued development of bomber defensive systems. Innovations in gun mounting systems, ammunition, and fire control systems are accelerated. Furthermore, the tactical principles demonstrated by the beam turn maneuver influence the development of subsequent air defense systems. After World War II, as jet aircraft and guided missiles become dominant, the principle that tactical geometry and coordination can overcome speed and maneuverability advantages remains relevant. The modern discipline of air defense, where coordinated systems of multiple defensive elements work together, owes conceptual debt to the lessons learned from the beam turn tactic. The tactic also influences thinking about coordinated defense against aircraft. The principle that multiple defensive elements can be more effective than individual elements operating independently becomes a foundation for Cold War-era air defense systems. The concept of creating a defensive system where defending aircraft, ground-based radar, and ground-based missiles all work together to defeat attacking aircraft finds precedent in the coordinated defensive tactics demonstrated by bomber formations using the beam turn maneuver. In the immediate post-war period, military strategists and aircraft designers studied the implications of the beam turn tactic extensively. The success of defensive tactics challenges simplistic assumptions about air superiority. The mere possession of faster, more maneuverable aircraft does not guarantee air superiority if the side with slower aircraft employs better tactics and maintains better coordination. This realization influences how militaries think about air combat for decades. The tactic also demonstrates the profound importance of training and doctrine in military effectiveness. A bomber formation with mediocre aircraft, properly trained and coordinated, executing effective tactics, can be more effective than a superior fighter force operating with inferior tactics. This principle has applications far beyond air combat. It influences thinking about ground warfare, naval warfare, and military operations generally. While the beam-turn tactic was dramatically successful in the particular engagement where it was prominently demonstrated, it is important to remember that air combat was deadly and devastating regardless of tactics. The gunner who pioneered the tactic did not survive the war. Like many young men who served as bomber gunners, he faced odds so desperate that survival was far from guaranteed. He participated in multiple missions. He witnessed the deaths of crew members and the destruction of aircraft. The psychological toll of continuous combat operations cannot be overstated. Bomber gunners experienced combat stress that few people in modern times can comprehend. Night after night, they climbed into their aircraft knowing that their chances of surviving were poor. Many crews did not complete their tour of operations. Many did not survive single missions. The gunner who pioneered the beam-turn tactic flew multiple successful missions. He participated in several air battles where his tactic was employed with success. He witnessed the destruction of German fighters by coordinated bomber defensive fire. He survived engagements that other crews did not survive. Yet his luck, as is often the case in combat, eventually ran out. On one of his later missions, his bomber was hit by flak from anti-aircraft guns on the ground. The damage was severe. The aircraft could not maintain altitude. The pilot ordered the crew to bail out. The gunner ejected from his aircraft with his parachute. He descended toward the ground, but he landed in territory controlled by German forces. He became a prisoner of war. He spent the remainder of the war in a German prison camp. The conditions were harsh. Food was insufficient. Medical care was minimal. Many prisoners died from disease, malnutrition, or the brutal treatment of guards. The gunner survived the prison camp, though barely. He was liberated when Allied forces overran the camp in the final months of the war. He returned to the United States after the war, weakened by his imprisonment but alive. He was hospitalized for a period to recover his health. He was celebrated for his innovations and his service. Yet the trauma of combat and captivity remained with him for the rest of his life. Like many bomber crews who survived the war, he struggled with what was later understood as post-traumatic stress disorder. The memories of colleagues who died, of the missions flown, of the prison camp stayed with him. The broader truth about the beam-turn tactic is that its success came at a human cost measured in lives lost and suffering endured. The tactic was indeed revolutionary in its tactical implications. It did indeed change air combat doctrine and influence aircraft design for decades. But the people who pioneered the tactic and who practiced it did so at enormous personal risk. Many did not survive. Those who did survive often carried physical and psychological wounds that affected them for decades after the war ended. The story of the gunner and the beam-turn tactic is ultimately a story about human innovation and courage in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances. It is a story about how one young man, through careful observation and creative thinking, recognized a fundamental flaw in conventional tactics and developed an alternative approach. It is a story about how that innovation was communicated, taught, and eventually adopted across an entire military organization. And it is a story about the immense personal cost borne by those who pioneered and practiced the innovation. In the decades following World War II, historians and military analysts have studied the beam-turn tactic extensively. The historical record regarding this particular engagement and the tactic's development has been subject to various interpretations and debates. Some accounts emphasize the dramatic success of the single engagement where 12 German fighters were destroyed or damaged. Other accounts suggest that the number might be somewhat lower or that some of the damage assessments might be inflated due to the fog of combat. Post-war interviews with German pilots who participated in air battles with American bomber formations provide corroborating testimony about the effectiveness of the beam-turn tactic. German pilots consistently report that American bombers began executing hard turns toward attacking fighters. German pilots state that these maneuvers created head-on attack situations that were tactically disadvantageous to fighters. German pilots described the concentrated defensive gunfire from bomber formations as devastating. The consistent testimony from German pilot survivors supports the basic historical record of the tactic's effectiveness. American bomber crews also provide extensive testimony about the development and practice of the beam-turn tactic. Interviews conducted decades after the war with gunners, pilots, and other crew members describe the innovation process, the training, the difficulties in execution, and the success achieved through practice and refinement. These interviews provide details about the specific individuals involved in developing the tactic and the specific engagements where the tactic proved successful. Military records, including after-action reports, casualty statistics, and combat reports, provide objective documentation of the tactic's effects. The statistics show clear changes in bomber loss rates after widespread adoption of the beam-turn tactic. In the months before the tactic was widely adopted, bomber losses to fighter attack ran at one level. In the months after adoption, losses declined significantly. The improvement in bomber survival rates correlates directly with the adoption of the beam-turn maneuver. Some military analysts have engaged in what might be called deflation of the achievement, suggesting that the impact of the beam-turn tactic was less significant than popular accounts suggest. These analysts point out that the tactic was not universally effective. Some fighter attacks still succeeded despite the tactic. Some bombers were still lost even while executing the maneuver. No single tactic, no matter how innovative, eliminates the dangers of air combat entirely. However, other analysts and historians emphasize that the tactic represented a genuine revolution in tactical thinking about air combat. The tactic demonstrated that tactics and coordination matter as much as individual aircraft performance. The tactic showed that a smaller force, less capable in terms of individual aircraft performance, could defend itself effectively against a larger force of superior fighters if the defensive force employed better tactics and maintained better coordination. These insights had implications that extended far beyond the specific application to bomber defense. The beam-turn tactic, while significant, is not the only tactical innovation developed during World War II that influenced subsequent air combat doctrine. Other innovations emerged from different parts of the air war and from different air forces. A comprehensive understanding of the beam-turn tactic requires placing it within the context of these other innovations. The German Air Force developed sophisticated tactical formations and attack techniques. The Schwarm formation, a 4-aircraft unit consisting of 2 fighting pairs, proved more effective than earlier 3-aircraft formations. The development of coordinated attack tactics where multiple fighters attacked bombers from different angles simultaneously represented sophisticated tactical thinking. These German innovations were eventually adopted by Allied air forces after the war. The Royal Air Force developed innovations in night fighter tactics and in fighter combat techniques that influenced post-war air combat doctrine. British pilots engaged in extended air campaigns against German bombers attacking England. The tactical and technical innovations developed in these campaigns influenced subsequent thinking about air defense and fighter tactics. Soviet pilots, fighting against the German Air Force on the Eastern Front, developed their own tactical innovations. Soviet pilots faced different challenges than Western Allied pilots, as they were defending against German fighters over Soviet territory. The tactics developed by Soviet pilots, while less well known in the West, represented sophisticated responses to the tactical and technical problems faced by Soviet air defense. What distinguished the beam-turn tactic among these various innovations was its fundamental challenge to assumptions about the relationship between aircraft performance and air combat effectiveness. Most other innovations represented refinements to existing doctrines or developments that worked within the accepted framework of how air combat should occur. The beam-turn tactic, in contrast, represented a fundamental challenge to assumptions about the asymmetry between defensive bombers and offensive fighters. The adoption of the beam-turn tactic by the Army Air Forces was not instantaneous or universal, despite the dramatic success demonstrated in the initial engagements. Military organizations, like all large bureaucracies, resist change. Established doctrine is defended by those who have developed expertise in existing approaches. Senior commanders who have built their reputations on existing tactics and doctrine are often reluctant to acknowledge that better approaches exist. The adoption process involved champions of the tactic advocating for its acceptance among skeptical senior officers. The gunner who pioneered the tactic, along with experienced pilots and gunnery instructors who had practiced the maneuver successfully, became advocates within the military organization. They presented evidence of success. They explained the tactical reasoning. They conducted training demonstrations. They gradually built a consensus among senior commanders that the tactics should be adopted and implemented throughout the bomber command. The training establishment had to be reorganized to accommodate the new tactic. Gunnery training programs had to be revised. New instructional materials had to be developed. Instructor pilots and gunnery instructors had to be trained to teach the new maneuver. Bomber bases throughout England had to conduct intensive training. The institutional machinery of the military, once set in motion toward adopting the new tactic, gradually transformed how thousands of pilots and gunners were trained. Some resistance persisted even after official adoption of the tactic. Individual squadron commanders sometimes resisted implementing the training. Some experienced pilots refused to practice the maneuver, believing that their experience validated the old tactics. Some gunners proved reluctant to learn new procedures. However, as losses decreased and the success of the tactic became evident, resistance gradually diminished. Peer pressure and the desire to see one's crew survive encouraged adoption. The process by which military organizations adopt innovations reveals fundamental truths about how large institutions function. Change is difficult and resisted. Innovation must be championed by specific individuals. Success must be demonstrated convincingly. Political support at senior levels must be secured. Training systems must be reorganized. Cultural attitudes must shift. None of these things happen quickly, but when they occur together, they can produce remarkably rapid transformation of how an entire organization functions. After World War II ended, the beam-turn tactic and the principles it embodied influenced how military organizations thought about air combat and air defense. The fundamental insights: that tactics matter as much as technology, that coordination multiplies effectiveness, that defensive systems can be highly effective if properly designed and coordinated, became foundational principles in post-war military thinking. During the Cold War, as the Soviet Union developed long-range bombers that threatened American territory, air defense systems were designed based partly on principles established by the beam-turn tactic. The integration of fighter aircraft, radar systems, ground-based missiles, and other defensive elements into coordinated air defense systems reflected the principle that coordinated defense could overcome technological disadvantages. The Air Defense Command and the subsequent NORAD system incorporated principles derived from World War II bomber defense tactics. In subsequent wars, the principles demonstrated by the beam-turn tactic continued to manifest in air combat. During the Korean War, American F-86 Sabre fighters and Soviet MiG-15 fighters engaged in extended air battles. The tactical principles demonstrated by both sides often reflected lessons learned from World War II, including the importance of coordinated tactics and the ability of clever tactics to overcome some technological disadvantages. Even in the jet age, when air combat seemed to have evolved beyond gun fighting toward missile combat, the principles of the beam-turn tactic remained relevant. pilots continued to employ tactical maneuvers designed to force attacking aircraft into unfavorable geometry. The principle of turning toward attacking fighters remained a tactic employed by fighter pilots. The lessons about the importance of tactical geometry persisted even as weapons systems evolved. In the modern era, with unmanned aircraft and beyond visual range missiles dominating air combat, some might assume that tactical innovations like the beam turn maneuver have become obsolete. However, military theorists continue to study the principles embodied in the tactic. The principle that intelligent tactical employment can offset technological disadvantages remains relevant even in the era of advanced missiles and electronic warfare. The story of the gunner and the beam-turn tactic is ultimately a story about the nature of warfare and human innovation under pressure. It demonstrates that warfare is not simply a matter of bringing superior technology and more resources to bear. Warfare is also about thinking, innovation, creativity, and the ability to perceive problems in new ways. Warfare is about organizational learning and the capacity to adopt new ideas even when they challenge established assumptions. The tactics employed in World War II air combat evolved continuously throughout the war. Both the Luftwaffe and the Allied air forces engaged in constant tactical innovation. Pilots learned from experience. Squadron commanders developed new tactics based on what worked and what did not. Training programs were adjusted based on what was learned in combat. This continuous process of learning and adaptation influenced the outcome of the air war as much as the production capacity of factories or the technical specifications of aircraft. The beam-turn tactic represents a particularly clear example of this process. One individual observed a problem. He thought creatively about potential solutions. He communicated his ideas to others. He advocated for change. The organization eventually adopted the innovation. The result was a transformation in tactical effectiveness. The process, compressed into a relatively brief period of time, shows how innovation and organizational change can occur even in large military bureaucracies during wartime. The story also demonstrates that significant historical events often pivot on the actions of individuals. Popular history often presents large-scale events as the inevitable result of broad historical forces. The outcome of World War II, the thinking goes, was predetermined by the superior economic capacity of the Allies and the fundamental unsustainability of Nazi aggression. This perspective is not entirely wrong. Economic capacity and productive output matter enormously in modern warfare. However, focusing exclusively on these large-scale factors obscures the role of individual initiative and innovation. The gunner who developed the beam-turn tactic was not a senior commander or a famous pilot. He was a young enlisted man in a role that society had designated as particularly dangerous and relatively low prestige. Yet his careful observation, creative thinking, and courage to advocate for change influenced military tactics that affected hundreds of thousands of lives. His story reminds us that significant historical consequences can flow from the actions of ordinary people who think deeply about problems and have the courage to challenge established wisdom. The beam-turn tactic, while tactically specific, rested on a broader tactical philosophy that represented a fundamental departure from how bomber defense had been conceived. The conventional philosophy held that bombers should attempt to maintain their formation, maintain their altitude, and maintain their speed. The defensive strategy was passive, accept attacks and attempt to shoot down attacking fighters while minimizing disruption to the bombing formation. The philosophy underlying the beam-turn tactic was fundamentally different. Instead of passive acceptance of an attack profile dictated by the attacker, the bomber formation would actively maneuver to create attack profiles favorable to the defender. Instead of accepting the fighter's choice of when and where to attack, the bomber would force the fighter to attack in a manner disadvantageous to the fighter. The defensive strategy became active rather than passive. This shift from passive to active defense had implications extending beyond the specific tactic. It suggested that defenders could influence the tactical situation rather than merely responding to it. It suggested that defenders had more options available to them than simple acceptance of the attacker's chosen approach. It suggested that with sufficient creativity and coordination, defenders might actually have advantages over attackers in certain circumstances. The philosophy also emphasized the value of concentration of force. Instead of spreading defensive fire across multiple attacking fighters, the beam-turn tactic encouraged concentrating the defensive fire of multiple bombers on single attacking fighters. This concentration of fire, enabled by the changed geometry created by the beam-turn maneuver, proved devastating to attacking fighters. The principle that concentration of fire is more effective than dispersed fire became an established principle in bomber defense doctrine. The philosophy further emphasized the importance of coordination and timing. The beam-turn maneuver could not be executed by individual bombers acting independently. It required pilots and gunners to coordinate precisely. It required pilots to trust the judgments of gunners about when to execute the maneuver. It required gunners to maintain discipline and timing. The maneuver forced the recognition that in air combat, coordination and communication between different members of a crew were critically important. The beam-turn tactic represented such a radical departure from conventional wisdom about air combat that it is worthwhile to examine in detail what the conventional wisdom had held and why it proved inadequate. The conventional wisdom about bomber defense held several key propositions. First, bombers should maintain formation integrity at all costs. The formation provided mutual defense, with the guns of multiple bombers creating a crossfire that would discourage or defeat attacking fighters. Formation discipline was viewed as essential to bomber survival. Second, bombers should attempt to maintain altitude and speed. The higher and faster a bomber could fly, the thinking went, the better it could defend itself. Altitude provided options for maneuvering. Speed provided options for escaping from attacking fighters. Defensive strategy consisted of maintaining these advantages whenever possible. Third, bombers should primarily employ a passive defense strategy. Pilots should fly their assigned course and maintain formation. Gunners should be alert and ready to return fire when attacked. The primary role of gunners was reactive rather than proactive. Gunners reacted to attacks that had already been initiated by fighters. Fourth, head-on attacks by fighters on bombers were viewed as inherently dangerous to fighters. The conventional wisdom held that fighters would naturally avoid head-on attacks and would instead attack from rear quarters where they could enjoy firing opportunities while remaining outside the effective range of the bomber's guns. The geometry of head-on attack was viewed as disadvantageous to the attacker, so fighter pilots would naturally avoid such attacks. The beam-turn tactic challenged all of these assumptions. It abandoned the principle that formation integrity must be maintained at all costs. Instead, it suggested that controlled breaking of formation, executing a coordinated maneuver that turned the bomber formation toward attacking fighters, was beneficial. It suggested that losing some formation cohesion in favor of achieving more favorable tactical geometry was a worthwhile trade-off. The tactic also challenged the assumption that maintaining altitude and speed was the primary defensive objective. Instead, it suggested that the tactical geometry of the engagement mattered more than altitude and speed. A bomber at lower altitude and reduced speed, but positioned to create a head-on engagement geometry, could be more defensively effective than a bomber at higher altitude and speed but positioned to receive rear-quarter attacks. The tactic converted bomber defense from a primarily passive strategy to an active, proactive strategy. Instead of reacting to attacks, bombers would anticipate attacks and maneuver to influence them. Gunners would not simply return fire when attacked but would communicate with pilots about maneuvering to create more favorable firing opportunities. Most radically, the tactic challenged the assumption that head-on attacks were inherently disadvantageous to attacking fighters. By deliberately creating head-on or near head-on engagement geometries, the beam-turn tactic acknowledged that from the bomber's perspective, these geometries could be advantageous. The tactic essentially invited fighters to attempt the very maneuvers that conventional wisdom said fighters would naturally avoid. The story of the gunner and the beam-turn tactic stands as one of the most remarkable examples of how individual innovation, creative thinking, and courage can influence the course of military history. What began as the observation of one young gunner that conventional bomber defense tactics were inadequate evolved into a tactical innovation that transformed how the Army Air Forces conducted air defense. The tactic demonstrated that tactical geometry and coordinated defensive fire could overcome the inherent advantages of speed and maneuverability that fighter aircraft possessed. The tactic saved lives. It reduced bomber losses. It increased the effectiveness of the bombing campaign. The beam-turn tactic was not ultimately decisive by itself in determining the outcome of World War II. The war was decided by many factors: the industrial capacity of the Allies, the strategic decisions of commanders, the courage of individual soldiers and airmen, technological innovations in many different areas, and ultimately the ability of the Allies to sustain operations over an extended period while Germany could not. No single tactical innovation, no matter how clever, determines the outcome of such a large conflict. However, the tactic had significance that extended beyond its immediate military applications. The tactic demonstrated principles that would influence military thinking for decades to come. The tactic showed that tactics matter as much as technology. The tactic showed that careful observation and creative thinking can solve tactical problems. The tactic showed that defenders are not passive victims of circumstance but can actively influence engagements. The tactic showed that large military organizations can adopt innovations even when those innovations challenge established doctrine. The gunner who pioneered the tactic, while not becoming as famous as some fighter pilots or generals, nonetheless left a legacy that influenced military thinking far beyond his own lifetime. His name may not be widely known today, but the principles he demonstrated remain relevant. Military innovators and subsequent generations studied his example. Tacticians and strategists learned from his success. The beam-turn tactic became a case study in how innovation occurs within military organizations and how tactical problems can be solved through creative thinking. The broader significance of this story is that it reminds us that history is not simply the inevitable unfolding of large impersonal forces. History is shaped by individual human beings who think carefully about problems and who have the courage to challenge established assumptions. It is shaped by people who observe reality carefully and ask why things are done the way they are done. It is shaped by people who imagine that things might be done differently and better. The gunner and his beam-turn tactic stand as an enduring example of how ordinary people, in extraordinary circumstances, can do extraordinary things that echo through history. The winter of 1943 and the spring of 1944, when the beam-turn tactic was pioneered and adopted, marked a turning point not just in the air war but in how military organizations understood innovation, adaptation, and the relationship between technology and tactics. The lesson that came from a single bomber formation's engagement with German fighters became a lesson that influenced military thinking across multiple wars and across multiple generations of military professionals. The gunner who changed air combat forever may have given his life to his country or survived with physical and psychological wounds. His personal story ended decades ago. But the legacy of his innovation continues to resonate. Military tacticians continue to study the principles he demonstrated. The value of coordinated defense, the importance of tactical geometry, the understanding that defenders are not passive but active participants in determining the outcome of engagements. These principles, demonstrated so vividly in the beam-turn tactic, remain relevant in the 21st century. The story of the gunner and the beam-turn tactic is ultimately a story about human possibility. It is a story about how one person, through observation and creativity, can perceive problems that others miss and develop solutions that others cannot imagine. It is a story about how individual initiative can ripple through large organizations and influence outcomes far beyond what the individual might have anticipated. It is a story about how courage and determination in the face of impossible circumstances can produce results that echo through history.